you.
Fantastic. Secretary General, what a privilege to hear you speak. That was a fascinating overview. I'm tempted to forget all the questions that we've had sent in to us and just ask you my own, but I'm not going to do that because we were absolutely inundated with questions that were sent in by people in this room, people who couldn't be here today, by email and on social media. We sadly won't have time to ask the vast majority of them, but I'll do my best to fit in as many as I can, and I'll try and bring in some comments that are coming through all the time on Twitter using the hashtag SGLondon. So in a minute, I'm going to take some questions from the floor. So if Madeleine Crowther, Abigail Reyes and Nathaniel Chan could please make themselves known to our roving mic assistants, I'll come to you in a second. But first, Secretary General, I'd like to ask you a question about your role. Throughout the selection process, there were calls for the Secretary General to do a huge number of things. Be a peace broker, a voice for the poor, someone who speaks truth to power, a diplomat, the conscience of the world, a hard-headed reformer. These are not functions that are always compatible all the time. And a lot of the questions we receive today are people calling you to speak out. Ujo Okpala would like you to speak out about Nigeria, Saeed Sabtan about Kashmir, Nathaniel Goddard about Gaza. A lot of people would like you to say more about a certain president of the United States. And speaking truth to power repeatedly came up as a key criterion for your job, not only in civil society polls, but also in your dialogue with member states. But of course, you need to work with states and with the powers that be as well. And you don't have any magic powers to compel states to act differently or to support the UN. How do you approach achieving that balance? How do you decide when to speak out?
I don't think I know how to answer this question, no? Because that is the most difficult balance to establish. There is one thing that must be clear for me. The objective is to serve people. The objective is not to have protagonism, or to be in the media, or to be in the news, or to become popular. The objective is to serve people. So I think it's the duty of a Secretary General, that is Secretary General of an intergovernmental organization, to do everything possible to make sure that governments do what they have to do in support of their own people. But it is also true that in some circumstances, when you completely fail on that objective, you will need to speak up, as you said, and to be able to clearly denounce what is wrong. The decision of what is the moment to move from one engagement to a more critical position is a very complex decision. And if I would say that, oh, it's very simple, I would be lying. No, it's a complex decision, and you need, in all situations, to measure it from the point of view of the interests of the people you serve. But sometimes you need to do both. I'll give you an example. Myanmar. No, the situation of the Rohingya community in Myanmar. It is clear for me that we need to engage with the government of Myanmar to improve the conditions of the Rohingya community in Myanmar. If we don't engage with the government, it will never happen. And we know how complex the situation is in Myanmar, between the civilian power and the military power. So this engagement is complex. But at the same time, you need to recognize that the Rohingyas are probably one of the most discriminated communities in the world. And you need to denounce the fact that their human rights are being violated in an horrible way. So how to combine these two approaches is, again, something that is sometimes difficult to measure. But in many circumstances, you need to combine both. But it's not an easy job.
No,
and I have to say that, unfortunately, a lot of the time that one spends in international organizations today is also doing some damage control.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating to have that insight on the sort of million little decisions you have to calibrate every day. So our first question, please, from Madeleine Crowther.
If your priority is prevention, 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 how do you plan to deal with long-running conflicts that no longer inspire the political will needed to restore peace?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part.
It was, if your priority is prevention, prevention, how do you plan to address conflicts that are already in existence, of long-running conflicts where there's a lack of political will? If we can just take the other two questions as well and maybe answer those three, that would be fantastic. So, Abigail Reyes, please.
With Security Council members such as the United States, Russia and China disagreeing about world problems like Syria and North Korea, how can the United Nations avoid just being a bystander?
Okay, the United Nations.
Sure. So the first question about prevention, the second question was, given disagreement within Security Council on problems such as Syria and North Korea, how can the UN avoid being a bystander?
Okay. I think we need to combine a very strong commitment to prevention, and prevention is a multi-pronged approach. Prevention is not only trying to make sure that we organize talks between two parties or a government and a rebel group that might become a violent one. Prevention has a lot to do with the social and economic situation of the country. Prevention has a lot to do with human rights. Violations of human rights are sometimes a first indicator that a conflict is approaching. Prevention has a lot to do with strengthening institutions, strengthening civil society, and strengthening governments and government capacities in some areas. So prevention is building resilience of communities in relation to adaptation to climate change. Prevention is all these things. But at the same time, we need to increase our investment capacity in conflict resolution. And that is where this second question is very important. We have seen in recent times that the Security Council, in relation to crucial aspects of conflicts that are taking place, is not able to come together. We have seen vetoes being expressed, and we have seen a paralysis in the possibility of the Security Council assuming the initiative in relation to the solution of certain conflicts. I would even go further. I think that today the Security Council is only able to fully address a crisis when the countries of the region are united in the way to deal with the crisis. We have seen in Gambia. In Gambia, the crisis, the countries of the region were united in relation to the crisis, and the Security Council could act. But if you look at South Sudan, where there were differences some time ago in relation to the way the countries of the region were looking into a possible solution, there was an attempted resolution in the Security Council on sanctions and embargoes, etc. It didn't go through. I mean, the Security Council was not able to come together. So one of the things that is very important when we try to create the conditions for the UN to be active in conflict resolution today is working a lot in diplomacy, preventive diplomacy and conflict resolution diplomacy with the different countries of the region, the different stakeholders of a conflict. And there is a lot of discreet diplomacy that is necessary beyond what can be done publicly. But for me, one thing is clear. There will only be peace in Syria or in any other of the conflicts we are witnessing when the parties to the conflict understand that they cannot win the war. When the parties to the conflict believe, or one of the parties believe that that party can win the war, it's very difficult. In the present situation, with the paralysis I mentioned at the Security Council, for the international community to stop it. My deep belief is that the wars that we are witnessing today are not winnable. My deep belief is these wars are wars in which everybody is losing. And this is what I've been trying to convince the so-called stakeholders of each conflict, those countries that have an influence on the parties to the conflict. And this is what I hope will be more and more the activity, the diplomatic activity, and more actors around the world working with the UN, with other regional organizations, to make those that are involved in conflicts, be it in Syria, be it in Yemen, be it in Libya, be it in South Sudan or wherever, that these conflicts have no possible winner, that only a political solution can solve them, and that it is in the interest of everybody that they are solved. If you look at Syria, Syria is not only today a drama for the Syrian people. Syria was the factor that created an enormous regional instability. We have seen how it has dramatically impacted Iraq, the consequences on Lebanon, the huge impact on the economy and the demographic situation in Jordan, not to mention the complexities now of the Turkish-Kurdish problem linked to the Syrian situation. All these, on the other hand, Syria conflict is clearly one of the reasons that is fueling global terrorism everywhere. So I think for all those that have an influence in the parties of the conflict, it's high time to understand that this is a war in which nobody is winning, and this is a war that became a danger for us all. To get to that point is what matters. I have to recognize we are not yet there.
Thank you very much. Just a quick note to say that SG London is trending on Twitter. It's #1 right now, so please keep your questions coming. And I'm going to change subject a little bit. We had a question from Harriet in Uganda about development and disability. She said, people with disabilities have been left out of development discussions for far too long. How are you going to change that? And before you answer, if we could go to Nathaniel with his question as well. We'll take those two together.
So one of the greatest challenges facing humanity today is a recent surge in nationalism. Einstein famously once described nationalism as an infantile disease, the measles of mankind. Now, I'm a millennial who was born in Hong Kong, raised in Canada, volunteered on 3 continents, and now I'm doing my master's in the UK. I'm sure there's many in the audience like myself who are global citizens. What can we do to combat this trend and create a friendlier world?
So one question on development and disability, and the second question on what can we as global citizens do to combat the trend of nationalism?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to understand that the number of persons with disability in the world is enormous. So we are not talking about something that interests a very small part of the global population. No, we are talking of something that should be in the center of all development strategies, should be in the center of all economic and social policies of all kinds, in education, in health, in urban development, and taking into account the way houses are built, etc. So it is very clear that this must be an enhanced priority. It is also clear that we have not done enough. In the UN, we have not done enough. And this is one of the areas we have selected in order to be able to correct what has been a, I would say, lack of sufficient commitment in the past. Now, I think that the most important contribution that Europe has given to the world civilization has been the values of the Enlightenment. And the values of the Enlightenment are unfortunately being put into question today. Tolerance, the primacy of reason, we see more and more irrational behaviors. And nationalism is one of those irrational behaviors, in the sense that it's not through nationalism that we are going to solve our problems. We are going to solve our problems through dialogue, mutual understanding, and international cooperation. But it's not only nationalism. It's nationalism, it's xenophobia, it's anti-Semitism, it's anti-Muslim hatred. We are seeing the development of these kind of feelings in our society, and this is something we need to fight. But it's not enough to fight it ideologically. It's not enough to say this is wrong. I think we need to look into the root causes of that. And many of those root causes are in the fact that I mentioned when I was speaking a few minutes ago, the fact that many people felt left behind. Many people felt that globalization had undermined their interests. Then an irrational approach to what we have witnessed in recent times in relation to the massive movements of population, to the idea that we can be threatened in our identity, that foreigners are coming and are going to change us. And the only way to solve this problem is investing in societies, investing in the social cohesion of societies, the inclusiveness of societies, making in societies that are all multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, and the British society is a fantastic example of that. I mean, you have, in this room, we can see that expression in a very eloquent way. But it would be a mistake to think that harmony can happen spontaneously and naturally. No, an investment is necessary to make each group feel that its identity is respected, but to make also each group feel that they belong to the community, that they are part of the community and are bounded by the values of the community as a whole. So I think that in our societies there is still a lot to be done in order to make sure that we address the root causes of this kind of behaviors, be it aggressive nationalism, xenophobia, or different forms of radicalization against this or that group. This is something in which we need to think in the way the software of our society is organized and in the way you create the conditions for difference to be understood, for difference to be respected, and also for those that are different to respect each other.
I'm sorry, we have pre-submitted questions. I'm afraid we can't. Sorry,
the question was?
The question was in Burma. Is genocide happening in your opinion? Is there any genocide happening in Burma and other Holocaust repeating?
Thank you. We've got your question on Burma.
I think that there is in Myanmar a very serious problem with several communities that is known. And the main concern that I've been expressing is in relation to the Rohingya community, and I hope that there will be a way in which it will be possible for that community to see their rights respected in the context of Myanmar.
So I think you've had your question. Thanks very much. I'm going to go to Sanduni Mudianzi next. So please could the mic get to her. But I just wanted to stay actually on the theme of nationalism because we had so many questions on the theme from Jamanur, Pranav Joshi, Stephen Marshall, Camilla Adams, Hilmi Kozioglu. And you're not going to be surprised that Brexit came up as a theme as well. It seems as though many countries, though, and I don't just want to talk about the UK here, are going through a process of recalibrating their relationship with the world, with each other. Something like a midlife crisis for states, maybe. But in the past, these sort of global power shifts have proved quite dangerous. So I wanted to ask how the UN will approach the challenge of a world that is increasingly multipolar and polarized.
Well, first of all, I think we need to be careful when we mix everything. No, I don't mix Brexit. That was a discussion among the British people, whether or not Britain should remain in the European Union, and this was a decision that the British people took. And there are arguments in favour and arguments against, and now the British government and the British people will have in dialogue with the European Union to find a way to make it happen. We shouldn't make that comparison of this thing with what is the expression of nationalism in situations in which that nationalism is an aggressive form that leads to conflict. I mean, I think we need to separate things, because if we start mixing everything, we will not be able to get to the conclusions that we want. But what it is for me clear is that there is today in the world a lot of anger of many people because they see progress, they see wealth, they see people living extremely well, and they feel left behind. And I think this is the factor that generates the largest number of these irrational behaviors. And the levels of inequality in the world have tremendously increased. I think if one compares, I think the 8 richest people in the world have more than 50% of the world population. And so when people are aware of these things, and especially in areas where there are high levels of unemployment, these kind of feelings tend to emerge. There is only one way to avoid it, is to address these problems, is to make these people understand that governments, international organizations care about them and try to develop the programs, be it of training, be it of job creation, be it of different forms of social policy, to address the problems that they have. Because if not, it will be natural for us to witness the emergence of this kind of expressions. So we need to fight against xenophobia, we need to fight against anti-Semitism, we need to fight against anti-Muslim hatred, but we need to be able to address, it's not enough to blame people, we need to be able to address the root causes of this phenomenon, and the UN needs to play a positive role in that, mobilizing societies, mobilizing countries for those problems to be effectively handled and effectively tackled.
Sandrine? Yes.
Sorry,
The question was, I think in a nutshell, does the UN Charter need an update because it was written over 70 years ago?
I have to say that the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Refugee Convention that I was taking care of when I was in UNHCR, I believe that if they were written today, they would probably become worse than what they are. So I would be very careful. I would be very careful in trying to change a number of texts that were drafted and approved in a very special moment in the history of mankind, that because of the horrors of the Second World War led people to really think seriously about the solutions we need to be able to live in peace. So I wouldn't touch the UN Charter. You were mentioning in your last question about multipolarity. And there is here one thing I would like to say. Some people have the illusion that when we moved from a bipolar world to a unipolar world, and we are now looking as if we are moving to a multipolar world, even if for the moment it's more chaotic than anything else, the idea that a multipolar world by itself will solve all problems, that it brings equilibrium and equilibrium harmony. I would like to remind you that Europe before the First World War was a multipolar continent, but without multilateral governance institutions. And the result was the First World War. So when we look at the multipolar world that slowly is being built, that is one reason more for the importance to strengthen multilateral forms of governance. And this is, I think, a very important argument in the discussion that we are having today.
I think that actually leads quite well to our next question. We ran a competition on Twitter, and the winner was chosen to ask their question today, and it's Louison Mazot. So if the mic could go to her, and also to Zenaida Anem for our, I think, unfortunately, our final question before we have to wrap up. So Louison?
Sorry, thank you for being here. Often the responsibilities of member states are misunderstood by the public opinion as failures from the UN corporate body as a whole. So my question is, what is your strategy against increasingly common UN bashing narratives? Thank you.
Member states.
What is your strategy against the sort of UN bashing narratives when people focus on, the UN having failed when actually possibly it's, member states' responsibility?
It's a very difficult strategy. It's a very difficult question. I'll give you an example. You remember many years ago there was a bombing bombardments in Lebanon, no? And there was a discussion in the Security Council whether or not those bombardments should be stopped. Now, independently now of the merits of what was being discussed, our UNHCR at the time, UNHCR staff in Lebanon was trying to help people with the UN shirts, and they were accused by the population of the decisions of the Security Council. I mean, blamed by the population of the decisions of the Security Council. It's very difficult to make this distinction. I mean, for the general public, people will look at the UN and see the UN. The fact is, one thing is Security Council, another thing is General Assembly, another thing is UNICEF, or the World Food Programme, or UNDP, or the Secretariat, or the peacekeeping forces. But one of the challenges we have is that the UN, in its complexity, generates many situations in which problems cannot be solved because member states are not in agreement, and the UN is blamed for that. What we need is to do everything possible to make the UN more effective and to make member states more able to come together and to overcome their differences, especially when the problems we face are so dramatic that indeed the contradictions of interest that exist among states in the majority of the situations I've witnessed, even when a paralysis occurs, it's my deep belief that there are more reasons for countries to unite than for countries to oppose each other.
And Zenaida for the final question. That wasn't Zenaida, but we can have a question if you want to answer on Iran before the mic goes to Zenaida. I'm very sorry, sir. We really don't have time for more questions. It would be fantastic if you
the UN has a number of very important instruments in relation to that. First of all, the UN has been involved consistently in a campaign against death penalty, and I consider, I come from the country, we believe we were the first to abolish death penalty, and I think it's very important that we all engage in abolishing death penalty, that nothing can justify in no circumstances whatsoever. But the UN has some very important instruments in relation to the protection of human rights. We have a High Commissioner for Human Rights that has been quite outspoken in many situations. We have a Human Rights Council that, with all the differences among states, has played a very important role. And indeed, in many situations, the UN has been able to limit and in some circumstances even to punish through the International Criminal Court violations of human rights. We have also the problem, as we know, that the International Criminal Court cannot act in all circumstances. It depends either of countries being members of the court or of a Security Council decision. But in any case, we have to recognize that many dramatic situations where human rights are violated have been positively addressed. Not all, not in all circumstances. Sometimes the different perspectives of key member states do not allow to go as far as we would like, but the commitment to human rights in all its dimensions is absolutely crucial in the life of the UN.
Thank you very much for answering that, and I hope we do actually now have Zenaida who is going to answer the question. Please give the mic to Zenaida and over to you for the final question. Thank you very much. Please, it would be very nice if you respected our questioner, please, who's come a long way to ask this question today.
What advice would you give young people such as myself who want to make a positive impact on the world, but feel that there's a lack of platforms for us to share our ideas?
So we have a lot of young people in the audience, about 50% of the audience is under 30, and Zenaida wanted to know what advice you'd give to young people who want to make an impact, but who find it very difficult to know what to do, how to have a platform to sort of share and discuss ideas and take action.
I think one of the crucial questions for the reform of political establishments in general and for the reform of international organizations is how to give adequate voice to young people and how to empower young people in the way organizations operate. We have not solved that problem. Sometimes we have a ridiculous situation to have elderly stateswomen or statesmen being envoys for young people. No, And I can even give you examples in the UN where that has happened. One of the things we are discussing today is what kind of mechanism can we establish instead of just convening a ministerial conference to discuss the problems of youth? What kind of mechanisms can we create, especially taking profit of technology and of social networks and others, to allow for this permanent interaction between young people organized around the world and the UN itself? The philosopher that has more influence in my own thinking is a German philosopher called Habermas. And Habermas has many contributions, but one of the ideas that I find more inspiring in Habermas is that a very important character in a modern democracy is the permanent flow of intercommunication between the civil society and the political society, and the fact that this permanent flow of intercommunication has an influence on political decisions, not only through elections every 4 or 5 years. Now, how to establish this permanent flow of communication between young people in general that are less organized in the formal civil society and political organizations and international organizations is something we have not yet been able to put in place. Because obviously the mechanisms of communication need to be different from the traditional ones and need to use much more technology, social media, etc. We are not yet there. Just to give you an idea how we are not there, in the UN there are 56 people working in the headquarters, working with radio, and 3 with social media. This shows how organizations are still living in another age of communication, and how that fact undermines the capacity to engage with young people that today has a completely different way to relate with these new forms of communication and new technologies. We have not solved that problem, and this is in the center of our present discussions in the Executive Committee of the Secretariat.
Thank you. And just one last question from me, actually. We've spoken about a lot of pretty depressing things today and noted some trends that aren't so positive. You've been very good about telling us, giving us examples of things that are going well. What message would you give us to make us sort of put a smile on our face? What gives us hope? What motivates you when you're at work thinking this is a good thing that's happening at the moment?
I have to say that still nothing has had more impact on me than the work I have done 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees. And to see people that has fled conflict in dramatic situations, that has lost everything, that has seen members of the family being killed, that has fled and drowned in the Mediterranean or whatever, and to see their courage, their commitment, their resilience, and their hope in the future is something that I can never forget, and is basically the reason why I became a candidate for Secretary General of the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Secretary General.